I know there's kind of a unsaid rule on YouTube that game review channels should just stick to doing 5 to 10 minute long reviews on newly released games, but I'm going to completely and flagrantly ignore that rule with this half-hour long video on a game that's been out for the better part of a year now. Keeping in line with the theme of my last video being a review on a game that tried desperately hard to be a successful spin-off of a much better and subsequently more popular title, today we're going to be taking a look at Wolfenstein Youngblood, Bethesda's second and newest attempt at reviving one of their staple franchises through an online co-op experience. It seems only appropriate to do so now that everyone else has gotten their chance to kick this game in the ribs as it so obviously deserves to be. A Wolfenstein-themed spin-off that doesn't allow you to play as any of the main cast from prior games, and is only playable in co-op with another player or a non-too-sophisticated bot. Oh boy, this is going to be a fun acid trip down the rabbit hole. I've been meaning to get around to covering Wolfenstein Youngblood for a while now, but sadly my first attempt of recording about 2 hours of co-op gameplay ended up corrupted and unusable, which was a bit disappointing as me and my friend experienced quite a few memorable moments, both in a good sense and a bad. Then once I had edited a good chunk of the remaining gameplay in Sony Vegas, the whole thing crashed and the save file broke too. Not only is Wolfenstein Youngblood a plague upon humanity, it also seems to be a plague upon my PC as well. So needless to say, this was the main contributing factor behind why I gave up working on a review when the game first came out, as I couldn't be bothered to repeat the game from the start. After a few months, now that the game's nonsensical nature has mostly been expunged from my memory, I decided to dip my toes back into the game's murky waters. Wolfenstein Youngblood, for those who've been living under a rock or something, is the newest installment in the long-standing Wolfenstein game series, acting as a sort of spin-off from the last game, Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. However, this newest Wolfenstein entry deviates from the prior games in several notable ways. Most prominently is its unique and its most controversial decision to abandon the previously established single-player format in favor of an online co-op multiplayer campaign. In addition to this, Youngblood, unlike its predecessors, presents somewhat more open-ended levels, although there are still many linear narrow pathways and tunnels that will doubtlessly invoke comparisons to the previously established Wolfenstein level design formula. That said, this will hardly be the first time that comparisons will be drawn between the game and past entries. Arguably one of Youngblood's most significant, and many would likely say as its most debatable, new game mechanic is its RPG-based leveling system. Now, RPG-based systems in first-person shooter games aren't necessarily a bad thing, in fact they can add quite a bit. Examples include games like Destiny 2 and the Borderlands series, both of which introduce concepts like leveling systems and random RNG-based loot and gear drop systems. Generally speaking, implementations like these can go a long way towards increasing a player's sense of investment in certain games, and can lead to increased replayability or continued play. But there are some potentially less desirable traits that can rear their ugly heads when developers choose to implement this particular gameplay structure. Namely among them, tedious combat grind. There are many times in Wolfenstein Youngblood where you find yourself surrounded by half a dozen or so enemies, or potentially more if you find yourself in a larger set-piece area of the map. And you can find yourself pouring multiple ammo clips into a single enemy as you desperately attempt to chip away at their health, while they conversely easily manage to deal critical damage to you with seemingly every hit. Normally I wouldn't mind this much if this was true only in regards to elite enemy types and boss type enemies, but at times even common military footmen are somehow able to withstand direct hits from my energy powered rocket launcher. When compared to the time to kill in Wolfenstein The New Order, where you could usually insta-kill most enemies with something as little as a simple pistol or knife, the time to kill ratio in Youngblood is so painfully slow it's downright stupid. You could be forgiven for thinking that Germany had started rationing out Captain America-like super soldier serums to nearly all its recruits. What makes the combat even more interesting, and I say interesting in a highly sarcastic way, is the utter lack of any new interesting enemies. While more than happy to take out your usual enemy grunts, officers, and steampunk mechanical monsters, it would have been cool to see more types of enemies added to the world. You're telling me that between this game and its predecessor Wolfenstein 2, in a roughly 20-year-long time gap, the German forces developed absolutely no new technological developments? In a world where they created fully armored soldiers and super mech monsters in the span of a few years, they do nothing in the following 20? Yeah, no, I'm calling BS on that one. How can the Germans have taken over the world by the late 60s using tech they had already had from way back in the 40s? If you're going to take such liberties with the Wolfenstein universe and lore, at least try to be consistent in your approach. One thing that has consistently been present in past Wolfenstein games and is all but gone here in Youngblood is the drawn-out high-stakes boss battles. In your typical Wolfenstein game, you'd often run into these highly overpowered bosses, all of whom would spout ridiculous B-movie type villainous monologue while attempting to obliterate you in anything within 100 square yards of you. Here in Youngblood, I can think of maybe only 2 such scripted boss battles spread out over the course of the entire campaign. And definitely don't expect bosses like that to randomly spawn in the world outside of missions, because that's not going to happen. The open world is something of a joke here. One of the new additions to the franchise I did quite like here was the character and weapon upgrade system. Upon leveling up, players are granted points to spend customizing different aspects of their character stats or weapon performance. I personally like it when games like Wolfenstein, which are already ridiculous by design, allow me, the player, even more leeway in regards to making my character as over the top as I possibly can. It's just fun to have that degree of customization over my character and arsenal. The upgrade system is kind of mixed. Certain upgrades do a decent job of adding new abilities and movement types for the player, all of which have a noticeable impact on gameplay, while others are literally nothing more than health, armor, and stamina upgrades. All the basic unessential stat upgrades we've seen far too many times in far too many RPG games in the past decade. Now, one drawback I absolutely cannot excuse or begin to even understand is that, for reasons best known to themselves, Bethesda decided it was a good idea to introduce a complicated and poorly described microtransaction system forcibly into the mix. Simply trying to keep track of the different currencies and offerings will confuse you almost as much as the kinds of microtransactions you'll find in most popular iOS games. When I play a Wolfenstein game, I expect everything I've gotten used to seeing in past games. A story that is both as overdramatic as it is ridiculously insane, gunplay that brings you back to the glory days of the 90s, where you felt like you were an unstoppable demigod of destruction, characters that were charming yet not overbearing, and a sense of self-aware humor to remind you that the game isn't trying to be a realistic interpretation of, well, anything. Fast forward to Youngblood and absolutely none of that appears at any point in the game. It's like the developers had an entire checklist of what components together form a good game, then inexplicably flipped the list on its head and went about doing the complete opposite. The presence of microtransactions, as pointless and unattractive as these, feels like another unnecessary slap in the face to anyone who had ever played and liked the Wolfenstein game prior. The system seems a even more offensive proposition when you consider that Youngblood is not a normal AAA multiplayer online game that offers constant new content updates and optimizations. Games like Overwatch and Fortnite can at least hide behind the pretense that such microtransactions contribute towards supporting future development of the core game. But seeing as Youngblood was designed as a standalone campaign-driven co-op experience, with no post-launch free DLC or any DLC to speak of, it cannot even get away with that feeble excuse. So now that I've had my minute or two of fun beating the hell out of the microtransaction pinata Bethesda so ill-advisedly saw fit to provide us, let's talk about the real underlining meat of the game, the co-op experience. Well, it's no Fallout 76, and that can only be a good thing. The first area of note is the combat, the main reason anyone plays Wolfenstein. And to get right to the point, here, it sucks. It sucks so hard it's painful to experience it, kind of like getting an inexperienced blowjob from someone who forgets not to involve their teeth in the process. In a move no Wolfenstein fan ever expected nor asked for, enemies now all have health bars that have to be worn down before you're able to kill them. As I mentioned earlier, a single gunfight between you and a dozen similarly leveled enemies can go on for up to a minute or more. Now, I've sunk probably 100 or so hours into Destiny 2, and I've been playing RPGs since I was a kid. I have no problem with enemies being bullet sponges, but I cannot understand why that formula is being shoved into Wolfenstein with the same haphazard force that one might stuff a turkey. Now, I'm not necessarily opposed to this if the only intent was to provide visual feedback to the player and make the whole experience feel like something out of an arcade game, which, to be fair, is how Bethesda marketed the game, but that's not where the story ends, not even close. Another very arcadey element worth bringing up is the level design. Gone are the days where you have anything resembling a linear campaign. Here, the game's entire structure, if such a word can be used so liberally here, is fractured into separate semi-open world zones, connected by a single fast travel map. There is no way to actually move around the map without using the fast travel system. So, get used to this map. Odds are you're going to be spending more time running from and to those fast travel map locations than you will actually be spending time fighting off enemies, because you'll be doing a lot of backtracking. Now, one of the only positive things really, I can say honestly about the world design is that the visual landscapes are awesome. One of the city locations in particular, I want to say it was the Paris location, looked like an amazing detailed knockoff of City 17 from Half-Life. It made me wish that the game was a little bit more of a Metroidvania type title, where instead of these separate multiple zones accessible only by fast travel, it was just one centralized hub world that actually incentivized and rewarded rich exploration. Imagine an actual breathing city where you can go into everything from skyscrapers to the sewers below, with each area having its own enemy types and difficulty settings. This would actually work pretty well with the game's current leveling system. Instead of placing artificial level caps on specific missions and side quests, you could just do that with different areas and open up the map over time to create a more natural and much less in-your-face version of the current leveling system. Basically, what I'm proposing is combine the world design of Doom Eternal with the leveling system of games like The Division 2. But of course, had they done that, the game wouldn't be as fun to rip apart as it is now. But probably the one thing above nearly all else I have to rip the game apart for is the complete absence of any kind of navigational aid. For some asinine reason, the developers did not include a minimap, nor is there any on-screen marker pointing the player towards where they need to go. You simply have to rely on your own familiarity with the map in order to get you from point A to point B. Now, I'm not necessarily opposed to this hardcore structure, but it just doesn't feel right in Wolfenstein for some reason, because the maps are not laid out in a way that players can very easily memorize certain pathways. If you're not going to have a navigational system, you have to design your game a certain way to naturally guide the player to where they need to go. And here, simply, that's not possible. I found myself getting lost way too many times than I ever should have been. And I'm the type of player that usually does a good enough job getting around the world. And upon looking online, I noticed many other players have reported similar problems in the past. There are many forum posts requesting the addition of a minimap or asking for help getting through certain areas of the game. To me, I have no problem with certain players asking for help beating a certain mission or overcoming a certain enemy type, but whenever players start getting confused about the map design, you can tell the game just needs a little bit of a rework. I quite enjoyed being able to play in cooperation with a second player, and having some backup can really make all the difference in certain firefights. That said, any game can be fun with friends if you have the right group of friends to work with. The question is, how good would the game be if you played on your own, or with a random online partner you've never met before? Youngblood does at least attempt to incentivize cooperation between players through the new co-op abilities. When one player gets low on health, the other player can use a cooldown ability to automatically send some instant healing their way. Additionally, if a player is shot down or otherwise loses all health, instead of immediately dying, they enter a incapacitated state, where their movement is heavily restricted to just crawling, and they lose the ability to hold any weapon. At this point, the player is presented with two options. 1. Hit one button to call out to the other player, which results in the character verbally screaming for help, and a notification will appear on the other player's end, alerting them to their teammate's plight. The second option is, well, just to die immediately, if you feel the other player is nowhere near enough to help you. This will cause you to lose one of your remaining lives. Both players have X amount of lives. I believe the amount is about 4 lives. Once you run out of lives, it's game over for both of you if you die. So I highly wouldn't recommend losing your lives. Extra lives can be found in certain, for lack of a better term, loot crates that can be found in the levels. These loot crates require 2 players to manually open them, and then, as inferred before, you get said extra life. Definitely keep an eye out for those, because those will make the difference at times between success and failure of any given quest, especially if you know you have a boss to go up against. Going back to the character abilities, other passive abilities, like the ability to temporarily enter an invisible state, is pretty cool. Although in most cases the extremely limited duration allows for very few moments of any actual practical application. The stealth ability also allows you to access a throwable melee weapon, in my case being a small axe, because axes are cool, although you can choose to have a knife or some other blade instead. For some reason you can't access the throwable melee weapon without first tapping into the invisibility mode, which is kind of odd. I don't understand why they designed it that way and didn't just allow players to quickly access the throwable weapon via key binding, but there are many strange developer decisions in this game, so who am I to say? I just don't get why they interlinked the two. It'd be like if grenades were inexplicably tied to the partner health boost ability. It's just not very good or applicable synergy. It's a pity that there isn't even more ability crossover between players. Hero class-based games like Overwatch and Paladins prove this is not only possible, but can lead to even greater synergy than what we see here in Youngblood. This particular implementation reminds me strongly of the sadly short-lived title Battleborn. One of the things I really liked about Battleborn was its rich, MOBA-esque ability unlocks over time. Wolfenstein seems to offer only 2 co-op abilities, and they cannot be exchanged for any other, which significantly limits your choice of tactics. I think Bethesda, despite the game's main offering of co-op multiplayer, was a bit reluctant to rely too strongly on the multiplayer aspect, out of fear of further alienating their largely single-player driven fanbase. But my personal opinion is if you're going to take a risk and transform a single-player franchise into an entirely co-op experience, why not go even farther and actually expand on these basic character abilities by adding entire extensive ability trees, and allow players to easily drop in and drop out abilities at will? Games like the BioShock series, especially BioShock Infinite, did this very well. But Youngblood, while being fairly good with weapon customization, kind of drops the ball here in regards to meaningful character customization. Now let's talk about the actual characters. I think it's safe to say that if there's one aspect of the game that's gotten more flack than any other, it's the main characters. It's seemingly become somewhat of a socio-political football among gamers. I've seen many articles written by game journalists saying basically if you hate on the characters, it's because you hate women, and I've seen criticisms from actual gamers saying the characters speak like they're from another planet. I'm fairly undecided on the whole issue myself. The voice acting for the game is really inconsistent. Some of the voice work, like that of the side characters like the girl's father, BJ, is pretty solid, but a lot of the voice work deliveries for most, if not all, of the other characters, especially the new characters, tends to be not good. Also, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, the facial animations for many of the characters seem really weird. I'm not sure if this is Bethesda's way of attempting to optimize the game for all platforms, but as a PC player, I've seen way better hair and facial animation in PS4 games like Horizon Zero Dawn than I see here in Youngblood. And the lip syncing is... it's terrible. It's terrible lip syncing. I don't know why in 2020 games still have trouble with the lip sync process. I understand that it's a technically difficult aspect to any game, but I think by now developers, especially ones with the backing of publishers like Bethesda, should be able to get this down pat without significant trouble. I'm not normally a big critic of stuff like lip syncing, hair physics, and facial animation quality, but here, everything just seems almost downright lazy. But without dispute, easily the game's biggest flaw in regards to its characters is its downright silly fanfiction-like dialogue quality. None of the main leads talk like actual human beings even half of the time. The sentence structure often seems very oddly placed and oddly formal at times. In addition to this, they just sporadically inject random swear words into a ton of sentences with no build-up, enthusiasm, or cause. I'm personally pretty open to characters being extremely vulgar when it seems applicable, like in high-intensity moments, or alternatively for comedic context. Samuel L. Jackson's role in Pulp Fiction is probably one of my favorite go-to examples for this. Also, Samuel Jackson is just a badass, so... But at most points here in Youngblood, it just comes off as if the dialogue figured, oh, well, teenagers swear a lot, so let's try to figure out how many times we can get these two women to swear in any given scene, and we'll work out the rest of the scene around that. Upon searching for the identity of the game's dialogue writer, I was unable to find a direct correlation. My best guess is that no one wanted to take credit for being the mastermind of this dubious work of art. But the closest match seems to be the game's credited narrative director, Tommy Tordson, whose only prior writing credits include working on in-game collectible notes for Wolfenstein 2 and working on some unspecified story scenes and dialogue from Wolfenstein: The New Order. Oh, and he also worked on the Chronicles of Riddick movie tie-in game as the lead writer. Truly the shining example of groundbreaking accomplishment in the video game industry. The two characters themselves, whose names I couldn't possibly bring myself to remember, don't really have any personality to them. They exist as basically walking cliches. It almost makes me think the writer was attempting to pull off a Life is Strange 1 relationship dynamic where you have one socially withdrawn, nerdy, but highly intelligent, brown-haired, freckled girl with high ambitions teaming up with her more outgoing, troublemaking counterpart as they throw themselves into situations far exceeding their capabilities with a make-it-up-as-you-go-along mentality. But the difference is the story flow of Life is Strange 1 didn't just stick with those two character archetypes and call it a day, but used those as the building blocks and gradually transformed those characters from being one-dimensional into full, three-dimensional people that felt like they could actually be real people. Yet here in Youngblood, you never really escape that initial one-dimensional aspect of the character development process. And that's a real disappointment. You never grow to like them. In fact, the more time you spend with them, the more the opposite proves true. I can't really fault the voice actors for their performance. The voice acting is okay. Nothing remarkable, but not a lot that'll make you grit your teeth excessively, although there are a few moments that do make me cringe. Though I can't decide if it's from the voice acting or the dialogue. It does seem to be a bit of both. Brown-haired twin Jess, I believe, was pretty good, while the voice acting for her sister was as forgettable as the character was herself. The supporting adult characters are all written and voiced reasonably well, which again begs the question why the developers couldn't write the main leads as well, or find voice actors that, actually did a better job of voice acting. Overall, I'd have to say Wolfenstein Youngblood is an incredibly disappointing experience. It's somewhat tolerable if you have a friend along for the ride, however when you're playing on your own, the companion AI is almost as broken as the enemy AI, and can hardly ever be relied upon to actually contribute to the gunfight, and will only aid you in some of the mandatory two-person levers after you've already initiated the process. If this was its own game separate from the Wolfenstein legacy altogether, it probably would have fared somewhat better critically. But given the fact that it is a direct successor following up on two of the greatest entries in the Wolfenstein series, it does raise the stakes considerably, and makes even the most insignificant of failures here in Youngblood that much more serious. While I do think Bethesda was smart not to charge a full $60 standard retail price for this spin-off, even now I can honestly say it's not worth it at $40. I could see it being of somewhat decent value at a lower price point like a $20 standalone DLC for Wolfenstein 2, but I think Bethesda was afraid to lower the price too much or market it as a DLC for fear that it would not get as many sales compared with it being a standalone game, like it ultimately was. Because Bethesda was probably afraid of not being taken seriously by both games and investors. In the end, none of it really helped, because no one playing this game or looking at it on YouTube or Twitch will ever take it seriously ever. As far as reboots or sequels go, it's not quite as offensive as Ghostbusters 2016, but it's not that far off either. At the end of the day, if you see it on sale, it's not a terrible game, but it is a pretty bad one. It is painfully mediocre. I can see on Steam the game's averaging only a 46% user rating compared to most of the Wolfenstein games in the past being in the high 70s and 80s. And given the microtransactions and the many other things wrong with the game, I can't argue with the score there. Youngblood for the Wolfenstein series is like that black spot on the horizon of The Lion King. Never go near it. On that note, I am going to wrap up this video here. If you liked it, please do consider hitting that like button down below. And if you want to see more review content, consider clicking the subscribe button down below and hitting the bell to stay notified when I release new videos. 2020 has been off to a terrific start thus far here on the channel, and as always, thank you. The channel just crossed 550 subscribers, something I'm really proud of. It's not quite as noteworthy as hitting 500 was, but what is impressive is how consistently the channel has been increasing in popularity, given that I actually upload less consistently than I used to, say a year ago. I have been getting a lot of really good feedback, which I do appreciate, and I'm already acting on. The current overlay you're seeing on screen now will soon be completely reworked in order to increase the size of the gameplay screen on the right, and cut back on some of the other non-essential elements on the screen. A very heartfelt thank you to those of you who follow what I do and watch my videos. Stay safe and don't get sick now. This is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, and peace out.